I have completed a series that I started in 2026. Do you know who this booktuber is? I certainly don't. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. It's Tori, and today we are going to talk about all of the books that I read in April of 2026. One of my big goals this year was to finish series, and not only did I finish a series, I finished a series that I started this year, which is wild, and I'm so incredibly proud of myself. So let's get into these reads. I had a smaller reading month in April. My grandfather passed away right at the end of March, and so that just there was a lot of family stuff going on. There was a lot going on in my personal life, and reading fell by the wayside a little bit more than it usually does, which is completely fine. All things considered, this was a fantastic reading month, and I am going to start out by talking to you about book 2 of the Cold Fire trilogy by C.S. Friedman. Now, this trilogy has been on my TBR for a while. You guys know that I read Black Sun Rising, I think in February, I'm pretty sure it was February, and really enjoyed it. I was so intrigued by her writing style, I was so intrigued by her prose, and by the character exploration that she was interested in doing, and I am very happy to report that that stayed strong through book 2, which, as we're going to talk about slightly later, book 2s have been a little bit of a hit or miss for me recently, and it's been really frustrating because I will really enjoy a book 1 in a series, and then I get to book 2, and I don't know if it's just a book 2 curse that I'm under right now, but thankfully Friedman came through with her book 2 of the Cold Fire trilogy, and I really enjoyed this. One of the things that I think really sets Friedman's work apart for me right now is it has a very classic fantasy feel, which I love. I've been really enjoying going back to that deep intrigue-based world building, a lot of kind of classic fantasy tropes, but I don't feel like Friedman utilizes them in a way that feels overburdened or same old like I've been finding in a lot of modern fantasy series. And I think one of my favorite parts about this series is that she sort of deconstructs the vampire trope that we have been seeing rampant in fantasy basically since Twilight kind of rehashed all of that, and now we have all of the paranormal romance focus and all of this sort of thing. And one of the things that has always driven me very bonkers about that is I think the romanticization of vampire type characters, the romanticization of immortal monsters. Now, last year I read Dracula by Bram Stoker, and it really was intriguing to me to see how the shift in how vampires have been utilized in fiction over the years it was so fascinating. Friedman utilizes the Dracula-esque trope in one of her characters in this series that walks that line of the vampire is built as a construct to be seductive, to draw people in, to throw people off guard. That is part of the character, part of the monster archetype, right? However, I feel like one of the problems I often have in modern vampire stories is that it kind of stops there. It turns a immortal vampire monster into someone who's just misunderstood, someone who's actually human under all of that. Friedman kind of deconstructs that trope throughout this trilogy and really explores deeply the question of, once you have left your mortal life behind, how much of it remains actually? How far can you remove yourself from your now immortal mindset and affinities and all of that sort of thing? And I just find that so fascinating. One of my favorite moral questions that fantasy asks in theme is, how far is too far in order to be redeemed? Is there a point where that redemption is not possible? What does that look like? What does it look like to atone for not just a lifetime of sins, but like multiple lifetimes worth of sins, and just some of the worst, most awful, heinous things that people can possibly do to each other, or a creature can do to another creature. And if it sounds heavy, it is. But I think she does it in such an intriguing way. Now, in terms of just the structure of this story, this second book has a lot of travel in it, just like the first one did, but even more of the travel kind of thing. It does read as a slower paced novel. The focus really is on the characters and their interpersonal relationships with each other and the conflict of the world at large and how those characters fit into that conflict. There's so much here that even though it is a slower paced structure, for me at least, the story didn't feel like it dragged. And I think a big part of that is because I'm a character first reader. And so even though the plot line was not moving at a super fast pace, the characters had me so hooked and so intrigued that I didn't really care, to be honest. The other thing about C.S. Friedman's work is the world building. Her world building is so fresh and unique. You have this science fiction meets fantasy meets horror based world on another planet somewhere out in space that is desperately trying to retain a lot of its Earth-like culture as far as the humans are concerned, and how that clashes with the planet's native creatures and native magic system. It is so fascinating, and the lore that we explore in book 2 that expands from book 1. We're on a different continent. We're discovering some lost history. Now, I will say one of my main gripes with the series is some of the descriptions around that seductiveness with some of the characters, well, they're basically both antagonists depending on how you look at it, but there was a character in the beginning of this book that's not a major player through the whole book, but who is kind of an interlude character. And she's depicted as being fairly young, and some of the language used to describe her reaction to a immortal character was questionable at best, in my opinion. I do think that Friedman does challenge a lot of those things throughout the story through her themes anyways, so I do appreciate that instead of just kind of dropping it there and leaving it like a lot of authors seem to do, she is concerned with delving into the way that we respond to these kind of vampiric characters and not portraying it in a way that glorifies them as some kind of romanticized, role model, I guess. I would say that this series is probably the most intriguing exploration of immortality that I have read in fantasy in a long time and potentially ever. So that's enough gushing for one video, and I'm going to put that down so that I can move on to the next book. Now, speaking of book 2s, I read another one in April. The Tyranny of Faith by Richard Swan. This is book 2 in his Empire of the Wolf trilogy, and it follows The Justice of Kings, which I read a month ago. ? Yes. I really enjoyed Justice of Kings. I thought it was really fun. It was really unique. I was hooked almost immediately and could not stop reading it. And I was really excited to move into Tyranny of Faith. However, this one was a massive letdown for me, to be honest. I felt like everything I loved about the first book and the way that the book seemed so sure of itself and where it was going, and it was digging into some aspects of fantasy economics and justice system that I don't feel like is as common. This one just kind of felt like a chaotic mess. The characters sort of went against everything that had been set up in book 1 in a lot of ways, and I'm a big fan of the idea of characters having a corruption arc or a madness arc, or making mistakes, circumstances changing them and them having to crawl back out of it, or just this slow kind of descent into becoming a different person. So I'm very much a fan of those kind of character journeys. This one did not feel purposeful. This one felt like we were being kind of flung around by the plot. There was so much packed in here between the history, between all of the different conflicts and antagonists that were being introduced, between the interpersonal dynamics of the main cast, and it just felt so chaotic and frustrating, especially through, I would say, the last 2/3 of the book, to be honest. I was so frustrated by this book. I did not enjoy my experience with it. The characters really felt like they were just being flung around by the plot points, and there wasn't really connective tissue in between those plot points, if that makes sense. It was like we would jump from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing, but there wasn't really anything bringing us in between those plot points. There wasn't really as much of a build-up or connection as I was hoping for, and so it ended up just kind of feeling like we were randomly jumping to different scenes, and the characters would sometimes act like we knew who they were, and sometimes they'd do something that I was like, okay, but why though? Like, other than this is what the plot needs, why is this character doing that? And it was so frustrating. It was so incredibly frustrating. And especially after, the second book of the Coldfire trilogy, I was hoping for a little bit of a better experience with this one. I don't know that I'm going to continue the trilogy. There's only one more book in this series, and I feel frustrated because I've read 2 books plus a prequel novella now within this world, and I just don't feel like I want to continue to book 3, because I don't feel like book 2 led me to a place that I want to continue reading about, which I'm really sad, because book 1 I really, really enjoyed. So that was frustrating. This one ended up not being a winner for me, so at this point, I'm not planning on continuing the series. I'm never gonna say never, like with anything else. But yeah, that one was definitely a letdown. I will say there was so much potential in the world building and the setup of the main characters, and the way that we're focusing really hard on a specific aspect of this world's government, and I found all of that really fascinating in book 1 and bits and pieces of book 2. I just felt like this book kind of got in its own way too much. The next book that I picked up was A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, and this is a middle grade young YA book that explores loss and grief. I picked it up because I am in a grieving process right now after losing my grandfather, and I really felt like I needed to read something that was going to speak into that grief a little bit, and I'm going to do my best to encapsulate my experience with this book. It starts off in not a very, it starts off feeling very similar to a lot of, middle grade stories. We have a young boy and he's living with his mom, and there's some things happening that are hard, and his, friends at school, there's some distance there. And as we go through the story, the layers of our main character Connor slowly start to be peeled away into the emotions that are going on at the very core of who he is as a person. And this is all done through the structure of a story that is facilitated by a monster of sorts. And I really enjoyed it up until the last, I would say, third of the book. And that's when it really all started to hit me, when we get into the deeper layers of Connor's grief and how he's dealing with loss and all of this. I was really touched by the story, and it was so cathartic to read. I cried my eyes out at the end, and I absolutely love this book. I feel like this was such a good book for me to read right now. I think I would have had a similar experience with it at any point. I still would have really enjoyed it at any point, but I feel like reading it right now, where it was allowed to kind of speak into that grief that I'm feeling right now. And of course, when it's someone that you've known since you were a very small child, there's a part of you, that child is still in there responding to that grief. And I think this book just so beautifully encapsulates all of the different hard, conflicting emotions that grief causes, whether you're an adult or a child. And it was really beautiful. I love the artwork in here. It's absolutely gorgeous. I didn't know it was a movie, so I am hoping that I can watch that at some point soon, because I'd love to see how this was adapted and how, you know, the art style that they chose to go with, and how they adapted the story for a visual medium. But yeah, this was really beautiful. I absolutely loved it. 5 stars, and I'm really happy that I read it when I did. Next up, I got approved for a advance review copy of Adrian Tchaikovsky's upcoming book, Green City Wars. This is basically a detective noir criminal underworld meets Redwall, which probably sounds a little crazy, but honestly, I've gotten to the point where I expect pretty much anything from Adrian Tchaikovsky in terms of inventiveness and just a fresh take on genre combinations and genre blending, mashup, character things and influences. He's so incredibly creative with the subgenres of fantasy. And this one was absolutely no different. This follows a character named Scotch, who is a raccoon. He's a mutated raccoon who is kind of a has-been. He's gone freelance. He works on hunting things down for his fellow creatures. And the world is set up in a way that the humans have created this kind of utopia above ground. They have this city that's this beautiful, you never have to really work and you don't have to see the ugliness of the world around you. And that's because all of these lab-created animals are working underneath the surface to make sure that everything runs properly, everything stays clean, all of this sort of thing. It is very dark, it's very gritty. It did take a little bit for me to be hooked by the story, and I think part of that is just because noir isn't really typically my jam, but I will say, as I got through the story, I think when I hit about the halfway mark, I was so invested in Scotch's journey and how he was going to come out of the situation that he finds himself in. Of course, Scotch gets wrapped up in conflicts between all of the powers that be in this sort of criminal animal underground, and he has to make some big moral decisions about the future of his city, which, you know, that was never his intention. He wasn't here to be a big player in a big game. He was here just to do a job and stay alive for a few more days. As always, you can tell that Tchaikovsky put a ton of thought into the concept of this story, and that's something that I've come to expect from him in everything that I've read of his, is that I know the concept is going to be really inventive, it's going to be really layered and intense and well thought out. And I loved that about this as well. I still don't know if I would say that noir is my go-to genre, but just it's so interesting to see this particular blend of something like grown-up grimdark Redwall meets noir storytelling. It's very, very interesting, and I look forward to seeing more people's reviews of it as it comes out. I think it's coming out in June or July this year. I'll put the date here on the screen. But yeah, I was super excited to get approved for this advanced review copy on NetGalley, so big thanks to the publisher for sending it my way, and I enjoyed once again seeing what on earth Adrian Tchaikovsky had cooked up in his writing kitchen, because he surprises me every single time. And last but not least, the finishing jewel on the crown of the Coldfire trilogy, which of course is Crown of Shadows, book 3. I'm getting a horrible glare on this cover. This one is the shortest of the trilogy. First of all, how often does that happen? I feel like every trilogy I know of just gets longer and longer and longer. And Friedman decided that her final volume was gonna be not a crazy chunk, which honestly, I kind of appreciated. And especially after book 2, where, like I said, we had a lot of traveling, we had a lot of time spent really digging into the characters. What I was hoping for from book 3 was the culmination of all of the things we've learned about these characters, and a culmination of a lot of the thematic questions that I'd been asking through the first 2 books. And I really enjoyed so many aspects of this finale. I love the dynamic between the 2 main characters so much. I find it so incredibly interesting. And Friedman does something in this trilogy that I appreciate so much when it's done well in fantasy, and that is a nuanced discussion of faith, whatever that looks like. And I feel like so many fantasy series portray faith in a way that is very one note, that is very kind of cardboard cutout or caricatured, and Friedman does not do that. Friedman's portrayal of essentially a Dracula-esque character in forced proximity with a very devout paladin-esque character, and how that pushes and pulls and tears at the 2 of them, and what kind of a relationship builds out of that, and what can it lead to, and what is the end product of that, is just fascinating to me. And there were so many answers in this final book that I already want to go back and spend more time just thinking about and journeying alongside these characters, because I find them so incredibly fascinating. I would say the reason why this finale at this point didn't get a full 5 stars out of me is because the ending felt satisfying in a lot of ways, but there was a lot of repetition. I felt like there was some repeats from the first 2 books where the endings all kind of felt similar, very similar, and there were almost multiple endings where something really big, this really big climactic thing would happen, and then we'd have the fallout, and then another really big climactic thing would happen, and we'd have the fallout, and then a really, like there were multiple times, and at that point I was like, no, I just want to see, like, is this actually happening, or are we done? And I kind of felt off balance a little bit, if that makes sense, by the end of it. That being said, and I still don't know how I feel about the very, very ending. I'm still percolating. I think a lot of what I was hoping to see did happen, and a few things that I was really hoping for kind of got left either unanswered or resolved in a way that I don't dislike, but it wasn't necessarily what I was hoping for, if that makes sense. So it's a kind of question of like objective versus subjective, and I do give myself the space to rate subjectively, because to some degree, because this trilogy is really incredible. I think it's one of my favorite series that I have read in a long time for a lot of reasons. It is dark, I will say. This is like kind of a threshold for me of grimdark that much beyond this, and I don't know that I'd be able to enjoy it. There were some things in this trilogy that are very disturbing. They're very dark. They're very hard to read. There's a lot of that, especially with that kind of Dracula vampiric exploration of one of the characters. What goes along with that is the victimization of a lot of innocent people, a lot of innocent women specifically, which, as you guys know, is something that I take very seriously in the books that I read. There's a scene in this final book that is so visually powerful and kind of speaks to that. I don't want to give away too much, obviously, but that was really showed me how seriously Friedman was taking her subject matter and the character that she was writing, and I really appreciated that. So yeah, overall, I would count this trilogy a success. 2 5 stars and a 4 star out of the 3 books, and I'm still thinking about it. I will be thinking about these characters and their journey for a long time in the future. I do see this series as being one that I will come back and reread, and I'm already really looking forward to coming into it with that kind of holistic view of everything that happens and seeing what I can glean on a reread. But yeah, I definitely think if it's something you're interested in, but you're not really sure how dark is too dark, feel free to message me and ask for trigger warnings if you're interested in that, because there are some content things in this trilogy that are, like I said, very heavy and very hard to read. So that is everything that I read in April this year, and I feel like I had a pretty darn good month. I'm so happy that I was able to finish the Coldfire trilogy. That was super exciting. I was a little bit bummed about Empire of the Wolf, but it is what it is. I don't know that I will return to it in the foreseeable future, but that's okay because there are a lot of other series up on my shelves that I anticipate absolutely loving, and I want to have time and space to get to them. So I would love to know down in the comments if you have had experience with any of these books, any of these series. Please let me know. Tell me all about how you felt about them. If any of them are on your TBR, if you're excited to read them, let me know. I hope you guys are having a fantastic week. I hope you are reading some 5-star reads, and I will see you in the next video.